Join our next speaker, Peyton, in an exciting presentation where he reveals the remarkable transformation of their chat-based service desk application.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's been a terrific morning here, and nice to see everyone in person. So I'm going to cover a little bit about Chime v5, Chime as a background, and then why we selected Orchard to move the application to. So our application is primarily designed to enable employees to get real-time help using the messaging platform that's installed in the organization. So password resets, can't get into mail, really all the common problems that we hear. Some of our customers might do 1,200 chats a month, and some of our customers might do 1,200 or even 2,000 chats a day. And in many cases, this becomes sort of the dominant platform to get help. Historically, we've supported, all the way back, same time. Then we moved through Link and OCS and Skype for Business. And then we carried this code base up through the MS Teams version. So we developed basically originally an on-premise application, OWN hosted on a VM that would integrate with these systems. So that's a little bit of background on Chime. I'll cover next why I selected Orchard, a high-level overview of our app and the design, walk through and give a demo of the application, and then we're going to cut to Eric, our main architect for this, and he's going to cover the pipeline design, which is really how we build chat workflows. So Eric will go into code on that and show some of that. And then on our breakout session, we have Patrick, who can cover web client theming. That's another avenue that the customers come into, is a web client. And then we also have Fikri, who could cover dashboard UI and SignalR, which we also use pretty heavily. So why did we look for a new application platform? So originally, the Chime v4, we do have to stand up a VM. We have to stand up a lot of certificates and database, and it's a lot of work, both for us and for customers. So I was looking for a SaaS model so that we could quickly deploy new tenants and push those out without a lot of complicated install taking place. And we could essentially automate that eventually. The other thing I was looking for when I started reviewing sort of our next platform was I was looking for really a CMS under the covers so that we could capture content. We use content for self-service deflection. Most of our customers moving forward, they want more self-service deflection. So as chat requests come in, before we route that chat request to a live agent, they would like to potentially self-service that and deflect it. And then we want to be able to rate that content. We want to be able to organize that content. We probably want to be able to hand that content off to another system so it can learn from it. So I was looking for a CMS that was SaaS-based that could also do multi-tenant. This chat workflow is really important for us. And a chat workflow, I'll demo a very simple one coming up. But a chat workflow is essentially we take an inbound request from a guest, a customer, and then we move that person through a series of questions. We might show some content to them, and eventually they either resolve the question, or if not, we route them to a human agent. So chat workflow for us is really important, and that's the core, is really the pipeline creation. So that's what Eric's going to cover. Also, as part of that, integration with Azure AI services. So we were already using Azure AI services for a bunch of things. We were using language translation. We could use it for sentiment. We could use it for summary, but that's critical for us, is the integration with that Azure AI services. And the other is native integration with Microsoft Teams and Office. And then under the covers, we're using a lot of FAQs. We have dashboards, reporting, workflow, web chat UI. So Orchard was a really good fit for this. It covers really almost everything that we have. And what we do have, as well as a lot of legacy C# code for both ticketing integration, as well as a lot of other areas. So the CMS platform was really appealing. right away, we kind of imagine that would capture FAQ content. So we're using the CMS to capture FAQs, and we're probably also going to have that capture knowledge-based content for the internal service desk folks to use. So FAQs are sort of natural. We also did some prototyping where we would take a lot of questions and kind of create our own model, so that we could send a question over to a model and get a list of answers or FAQs that would be useful. So this we know we want to do, and we're wired for that right now, and we'll start to layer on ratings, and we'll also start to expand more with Azure AI. But we know moving forward, the slope is there'll be more deflection, less chats moving to live agents, but that's going to take feedback, and it's going to take some other things. Multi-tenant, for us, that was critical. Right now, when we stand up in Chime V4 a customer, it's expensive both in terms of time and hardware and services. So we were looking for a way to onboard tenants very easily, and Orchard's providing that for us. We still work through sort of automating a lot of that. Right now, it takes us, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes to onboard and create a tenant, and I'll show a tenant essentially out of the box. So we were looking for all of those things, and Orchard provides all of that. The other is in authentication with Office 365. All of our customers are Office 365. Typically, they want to take our application and pin it to the left side of Teams. And then they want to allow their employees to come in and hit the application directly from the Teams channel. So what we've done is we're leveraging the CMS. We have tenant level features that we can turn on and off at a tenant level. Right now, most of those features are on across our tenants, but we will have the ability to sort of enable certain features and disable them as at will. It's nice to separate out features and content and allow those to be turned on sort of independently. So in some cases, we might want to turn on an outage feature, and that's encapsulated in an Orchard feature that both includes UI and content, and we leverage recipes pretty heavily. Eric's going to cover the conversational chat pipeline. For us, that's really the core, because what we're doing is we're creating a chat workflow. And when a chat comes into us, we're going to surface up some adaptive cards. We're going to ask some questions, and then we're going to attempt to route or self-service that. We might also engage with a ticketing service. We might also engage with other systems that are out there, and our pipeline facility allows us to do that. We've already covered the Azure AI services. We do use cognitive services heavily. For a while, we were using Azure Q&A, but we'll use Azure AI services, and we can imagine, I was looking at probably 60 months ago, an SEO example feature that layered SEO features on top of content objects. And right away, I saw that for us, what we will do is we will add some cognitive services to these content objects, and we'll layer things that we're getting back from those services on top of that. 3-sentence summary, keyword detection, entity detection, all that. We also use adaptive cards pretty heavily. And for our real-time notifications on dashboards, we're using SignalR, and we're also using real-time language translation. So Orchard allows us to split apart the development into these component features, and it allowed us to essentially build this up at a feature level. So we have a lot of features right now, and Orchard allowed us to build that up. We also couple features with recipes so that as that feature's deployed, it's typically also installing a bunch of content that would be relevant for that. So with our, say, chat UI, web chat UI, it not only creates the content objects, but it also deploys out the content to fill in those definitions, and we get all that out of the box. We also do that with FAQs. So when we deploy a tenant, the tenant sort of automatically receives a whole bunch of content. And we're also doing that content for things in addition to things that you would expect, like FAQs and knowledge-based articles. We're also using content definitions to house a lot of other things. So we're using content definitions to house our pipelines. We're also using content definitions to house our report definitions. So we can create reports sort of on the fly now. Before, that was a pain point for us. We had to code reports in C# and then provide a DLL, or we had to include them in our mainline build. Now we can create reports, their content, and we can move that content to tenants, and we can pull that in. So we're using content definitions across the board for a lot more than just FAQs and knowledge base articles. We're really using it under the cover for almost everything. We also have elements that emit events up to the workflow manager. We're using Workflow Manager right now mostly for things like email notification when new users are onboarded to a tenant, but we're emitting events to Workflow Manager that we're currently not doing a lot with, but we've also added other things to Workflow Manager. So I'm going to cover the sort of the admin UI, which is where we started. We've separated out manager UI so that managers of service desks have a different UI experience. Agents have a different UI experience, and then reporting kind of covers all of that. And then the chat pipeline is a good one that we'll cover. So here's just a sort of a snapshot of some of the features that we have. So we're using adaptive cards so that when we install sort of the adaptive card feature, we get a renderer for adaptive card and we have a place to store them. We are using workflows. This is pipeline. So really, this is sort of a you could imagine this is a list of our UI and elements that we're using here. Featured content allows us to sort of manage FAQs for the guest looking in. Pipeline. So Eric will cover pipeline in more detail, but a chat pipeline for us is essentially a chat workflow. And in our Chime v4, it was fairly static. A request would come in. There were a set of events that we would queue off of. We would provide standard replies back to the user. And then we could integrate with that, but it was a little time consuming if we had to build custom integration. And then we would route to a service desk agent. What we've done is we've opened that completely up so that we can plug new chat pipeline providers in that could do different things. And then we can connect all these chat pipelines and we can create a workflow that's seamless. We can use adaptive cards as part of that, or we can also use JavaScript, or we can call out. We capture it all for reporting. So for our customers, reporting is key. And these pipelines, as this data, this chat session's moving through our system, we can also capture additional metadata about that session. And then the reports can report on that metadata sort of out of the box because we all get to look at that metadata. So this is sort of a high level of, you can see that this is sort of a standard Orchard content view here. And these are chat pipelines. So each pipeline represents sort of a different chat workflow that's there. And really everything on the left side here, reports, content, these are really under the covers, probably using content definitions. We found content when I was originally looking at this. I found Content Manager really interesting, and it was pleasant to work with. And it was pretty interesting how we could also import content and leverage Content Manager for things, and how we could override content definitions. So the idea that a feature could kind of come along and override a content definition is very interesting, and that we can use things. So we'll cover, Eric will go through this, which is sort of some of these pipeline provider instances. When we first started pipeline development, we really only had a couple of these, and we keep building these up, and they're provided as features. A couple of other things that are sort of interesting here. Pipelines, reports, FAQ content, almost everything is very easy for us to move between tenants and between, say, a CI instance and possibly a prod instance. So we're using import-export with some modifications so that we can move this content between our instances and tenants. Here's just an example of a pipeline example. So a chat comes in. This is sort of our v4 sort of version, which is a chat comes in, we issue a welcome card, and then we would connect to an agent, and then an agent would have a session with the user, and then we'd send a feedback card, and then we would end. Here, a user might come in, We might have them select an OS or a language, and then we could do different things with them. Here's some of our workflow events that we do cover. So we might emit events when a chat session ends, or when it begins, or when an agent's connected. And we also use workflow to help onboard tenants. And then this is a UI manager sample. Let me just sort of switch to the live view. So this is an example tenant that we stood up, and this is the manager perspective. So the managers are really, typically, they might have this dashboard on a wall, or they might be looking at inbound chats. So this is a manager perspective. And for customers that are using this, normally they would have, several chats waiting, several chats connected. And then the managers are sort of watching the agent perspective. We are using SignalR here. So I'm logged in as Peyton. And then I also have some SignalR presence that we're using. So as I toggle this, and we're leveraging SignalR for the presence of agents so that we know to distribute chats to agents and things like that. We're also using SignalR for all the dashboard notifications. This dashboard is configurable, so I can go in and I can manage that dashboard. And then these are now widgets that we can move around. Our reporting, the reports are held as content objects, and we can go and we can add custom reports here. So we have a report widget that would allow us to pick a report that we might want to add to that dashboard. And so we can do that. And that's been very helpful because all of our customers typically wanted to customize their dashboards. So let me just, active chats are going to show active chats as they're coming into the system. Chat history, that will show chats that took place. And for all of this, we're always capturing all of the data under the covers. So here we are. This is a chat that came in via load test that we were running, custom metadata that we're capturing, routing information. So how did we route? Did we route to an agent? Some other flow, and then history for this user. Agent lists. These are a lot of cases we might divide agents into languages. So there might be agents for different languages or different geographies. So agent lists can be managed. And then pipelines. Eric will be covering pipelines, but here are pipelines, an example of a pipeline. And here we're using a few things that are interesting. So this is a content object, content definition. And we have this is a pipeline, and we're using Mermaid to display this. We can edit that. And then we've also created an adaptive card renderer, and we're storing adaptive cards. We have an adaptive card library, but adaptive cards can also be part of this. And if I were to pop that out, we can go in and we can create adaptive cards. So this is how we're creating our UI, so that when guests or users come in, they can interact with a form that can be customized. Couple of other things that are useful here. The branding of these adaptive cards, we're piggybacking off of the media library. So we have a branding folder, and then card-logo is, a name we've decided on. So if we want to customize a customer logo, we would drop it into the branding folder, and all of the cards that we've built and that are available are automatically going to get customer branding. And this is also done in a similar way. So we have an adaptive card feature that also has a renderer, and that the pipeline can serve up when it hands content back. Reports. So in our earlier version, reports were all hard-coded, and we could create them pretty quickly, but a lot of times customers want their own. And when we're combining new pipelines that are carrying new data, we might want to create associated reports that would go with that pipeline. So there could be a custom workflow that folks would want that is unique to their company. So they would create some custom pipelines. The adaptive cards could associate new data there, and then they could create new reports. So these reports are managed as documents, and then our report engine basically knows how to execute those and come up. So reports are managed as documents, like most things in Orchard. We can kind of move them around between tenants. We can add new reports at will by creating a new report or report definitions, and we can add categories as well. So this is all just managed via Orchard. And then content. So this, I'll just walk through this and then I'll do a demo. Standard replies are essentially content that service desk agents would want to hand back and be made available. So we have a feature that enables standard replies. This is content, and we pre-fill those with recipes. So as this tenant stood up, there are automatically standard replies there. FAQs. FAQs are obviously frequently asked questions, and then we're going to expose those two ways. We're going to expose those through a front-end UI. We're also going to search those as a chat request comes through. We're going to use that as sort of a content repository to search so that we can try to answer a question. We provide this out of the box. This is a recipe that's just sort of pushed down to the tenant so that when FAQs are enabled and we stand up the tenant, we also pull in that recipe, and a whole bunch of default FAQs are sort of out of the box. That's very, very helpful. Featured content. This is a way for us to organize those FAQs. So customers are always going to have their own sort of categories for this. But here they can organize that content however they would want. And I'll just do one thing. As we onboard a tenant, basically what we'll do is we'll stand up and authorize an admin. The admin will go ahead and create a manager, and then the manager will go ahead and add users. And those users are service desk agents. And then when a user is added, we're going to kind of kick off an event to the workflow manager. And then the workflow manager is going to go ahead and send that user an email with some information on how to get in. So we're using workflow for some background workflow events, and it's been very helpful. So let me just pop over to sort of what the front of the UI looks like, and then walk through a demo, and then poke some more. So here's a default landing page for this tenant. These are FAQs that were automatically staged there, and here are the categories of those FAQs. So this information's been laid down automatically as soon as this tenant was created. Of course, customers can come in and customize that, and that is all very easy for them to do. We did want to provide some default content out of the box. So folks can also come in. They can come in through a chat UI. This chat UI is Bot Framework. Under the covers, we have some theming services that Patrick built so that we could theme backgrounds, we could theme avatars. This is an adaptive card, which is the first thing of a pipeline where we're asking a question. And then after this question's asked, we're going to search some FAQs, and then we're going to route. So theming and all of that was done with Orchard as well. There's another avenue that folks come in. And in this case, this is really sort of the goal, is that this is a sandbox tenant. And here this is an Office 365 sandbox tenant. And what we've done is we've associated Chime G5 icon over there. And what's going to happen is that this tenant that this user's in has a tenant ID. And when the user comes in and hits our endpoint in Bot Framework, we're going to look at that tenant ID, and we're going to see if we have a tenant here that's been configured for that tenant ID. And if we do, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move that user down, and we're going to move them into this default pipeline. So a user is coming in through really any Teams client and any organization. They're going to come in and hit us. They're going to get associated with a tenant ID, and then they're going to get moved down into this pipeline. So let me just come in and ask a question. Oops. So this is going to hit a pipeline. Pipeline's going to send up a welcome card. This is an adaptive card that's configurable. We have an adaptive card library, so we're using Orchard to sort of store an adaptive card library. This branding is coming from Media Library. We're going to now, that pipeline's going to go and do some stuff. We're going to extract keywords using some Azure Cognitive Services, and then we're going to tee up content from the FAQ service to help configure that. So if the user comes in, we're going to try to deflect. This deflection will get more involved. So right now it's FAQs. sending up those FAQs, but in the future, there would be some other things taking place there. So here, the user wasn't helped, so now they're going to route to an agent. So if I were to look at my manager dashboard here, we're going to come in and we're going to see someone's waiting. If I were to look at here, I could see the state that they're waiting in. And if I wanted, I could switch over to the agent dashboard and I could also see someone's waiting. So we have segmented users between agents and managers. And if the agent wants to pick that up, they can pick that up. And this is a very simple sort of inbound request, but it does demonstrate basic pipeline and coming in. So now on this side, my Teams is telling me I'm connected, and then I can help. Couple other things that we're using here. So this is a sort of old style. We borrowed this from a context window extension of Link. We've got metadata. All of this can be associated and we're reporting on it. Routing is going to show who we prompted and which agent accepted. Some flow is going to track basically all of the pipeline activities that this user moved through as they came in. And then history is going to be the history of this user coming in. So we can go ahead and we can do this. And then we're going to go ahead and we'll leave the chat. When we leave the chat, then another pipeline activity is going to basically get involved. Is going to ask if we want to rate this. So we'll provide some feedback. And then be on our way. So in the simplest case, that's one user coming in. Our customers are experiencing, typically they'll have 5 to 10 to 15 agents. Some customers might have 100+ agents spread across multiple geographies. So UI-wise, we've split. We originally started with sort of the core Orchard admin UI, which is here. And we do have some admin content that we've created there, but we also created the manager UI that was totally focused on manager experience. And then the agent UI completely focused on agent UI, agent experience. And then just one thing before I switch over to Eric. So on the admin level, we have some settings that are specific to this tenant. Mostly it's the Office 365 tenant ID that's really important to us. And then there are also some settings having to do with cognitive services and other things that in the sort of months ago, we were kind of pushing down to each tenant and we're having to set them. And right now what we're doing is we're borrowing that in some places like here, we're going to borrow that from our root. So we don't have to push all these settings down to the tenant anymore. We're going to go ahead and borrow some of those. So just a quick sort of background on Chime, how we're using it and how we've built out some UI in different areas we're using. And now if I could switch to Eric, and Eric could go through some of the details of the pipeline.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Eric. I'm going to mute.
Let's see if I can get. Every time the Teams sharing UI is lots of fun. So I'll sort of start. Right. So as Peyton has kind of gone through, this is sort of the 5th iteration of our help desk product. And one of the things that has been difficult for us in the past is customizing a chat workflow for customers, because everybody always wants, their own particular workflow. And previously we had sort of a static state machine that had some integration points, but was kind of difficult to customize. So one of the things that we've changed in this new iteration of our product is to leverage some of these orchard content types to make it easy to plug in a more configurable version of the state machine in our chat workflow. So Peyton's covered a lot of this stuff, but our chat pipeline is an orchard document which will contain sort of the configuration of this workflow. And each portion of that workflow is made up of stages, which are also an orchard content item that we'll create as a new feature. So right, so typically we will develop each new stage that we've created for a pipeline as a new orchard module. And then that sort of makes it easy to segment these things and to split them up appropriately. Oh. And I think it's probably easier if I just switch over to show the live version of this. And I can kind of go through what these pipelines look like and how we've sort of developed this and talk about some of the ways that Orchard has made this easier for us to develop. So here we have a chat pipeline document where we have, this originally was a bag part that we've modified very heavily to sort of add this mermaid diagram part. And then we have, this is sort of a standard bag part that we've changed so that our pipeline items will register themselves with a service at startup, and then they can be, applied to this bag part and selected to create new items. Something that, it's one of the advantages of using Orchard has been that we've had all of this prepackaged UI available to us. So, we can just sort of create these documents, and then we can apply, content fields and reusable content parts. And that saves us so much time when we're doing development of these things, and we can focus on, the actual domain logic that's more interesting rather than all of this UI work on the back end. So we kind of look at each of these pipeline items is enabled as a Chime feature or a Orchard feature here in the features section. So we have, basically there's kind of one-to-one correspondence between a feature and then a pipeline item that we can use in one of our pipelines. And so the And so if I'll sort of jump to a basic version of one of these to sort of explain how we're doing some things here. And I'm sure you folks can all criticize some of the things that I'm doing because we've only been using Orchard for about 18 months at this point. And we're relative neophytes here. But essentially, this is sort of a very basic chat pipeline item, which is going to just send a single chat message down to the user. And so we'll start with, you've got, an Orchard CMS module. So we'll have, a standard manifest file, a regular startup file where we'll add, a data migration where we lay out the content items and content parts that make up this pipeline item, and typical startup stuff. And then we're sort of registering this pipeline with our pipeline service, which integrates with that pipeline editor that we showed before. And these are, I'll be honest, these are not terribly interesting documents. They're just sort of some text fields which show, as we had. Right, in this case, I've got my send text. We've got some text fields. Something I tend to like to do in my content parts and content items that I build is I'll put in, a function that will build that with the content definition manager, which sort of, I like to keep the definition of a content part and the migration code for that content part in the same place rather than split apart. Oh.
Hey, Eric, what were some of the first pipeline activity providers you created, and have you changed sort of styling since you created some of the first ones to what we're building now?
Yeah, so typically, we started sort of with these basic text message and adaptive card pipeline items. And as time has gone on, we've built many, many of these things. I think you had some more complicated examples, but generally the idea is that we can, take these things and we can add in, if you can add in additional validations to a chat pipeline workflow, and it gives us a lot of flexibility to, adapt and respond to customer requests kind of on the fly without having to make a lot of code changes just by changing this configuration.
And then I guess the other, so we started with some basics. So can a chat pipeline sort of work? Can we configure it? And then we we sort of historically know a lot of the elements that we'd want to do there. We typically want to send a welcome card where we collect a question, but after the welcome card, we might want to show a list of active tickets that user might have, or we might want to take their question and do an FAQ lookup, or we might want to immediately route them to agents. And so as we look forward, basically the pipeline activity provider list will continue to grow. We can bolt those together in different ways. And as the state changes from that inbound connection coming in, we're registering all those state changes up to sort of an event hook, and then SignalR's dispatching those state change notifications down to us. So we can sort of see users moving through that pipeline. Each pipeline element can add metadata to that session. Reporting at the end of that can report on that. And the combination of that's given us a way to also split apart the development so that Eric could sort of focus on the core, like what's the service provider look like? And then other folks can almost be consumers of that, and they can go ahead and they can take, okay, let's build a ticketing service for, say, ServiceNow, or let's build an FAQ lookup service, or let's build a JavaScript version of one of those providers. And they're internally, they've kind of become consumers of this service that Eric's laid out. And then we separate those into Orchard features. And then we go, we have that sort of feature list enabled. The other thing moving forward that we will do is we will tier the service, sort of the feature list for different tenants. So some tenants might have a very basic list of these pipeline activity providers, and other tenants or customers might have a more robust set of those activity providers. And some of that will have to do with, say, things like Azure AI services, where we'll basically push those services down. There'll be some additional service providers that will be built to integrate with those. They'll be delivered as features. They can be enabled at the tenant level. And then mostly we've just added some ability for the tenant level services to grab those, let's say, API keys or API endpoints up from the root tenant. So the sort of splitting apart of this into features has been very useful. And we did look at, that is Mermaid, we did look at using workflow. And in fact, we emit a lot of events up to workflow. We didn't really want to get boxed necessarily into workflow, and it was a lot to bite off when we first started. So we kind of are viewing workflow as very good at sort of maybe background tasks, email notifications. We could use workflow to identify if too many people are waiting to be helped, or if wait times are extended. We could use workflow for that, and we're underutilizing Workflow Manager right now, but that is something that we'll continue to turn on, and we'll continue to turn on events emitting out of some of these. Eric, anything else you'd want to show, or any other content you'd want to show there?
There are some questions I see about Mermaid diagram versus using the Orchard core workflow.
Yeah.
The primary reason that we went this direction is that we had some familiarity with Mermaid, so it was relatively easy for me to write some code that would take the connections between our state objects for these chat state elements, and then I could build out the code to write that into an Orchard diagram. If I'd had more time and knew more what I was doing a year ago, I might have gone with something based on the Orchard workflow UI and library, but hindsight is 2020.
So I raised my hand, but I agree with your statement. I would not say use the workflow, and that's what you found out. The workflow module is not for you, but the editor that the workflow module is using might be in the future the best thing, because you can use it to edit and display the pipeline at the same time. So that's why it's better.
Right. Yeah, there'd be some learning curve there to figure out how that all worked. And yeah, this is sort of what we have so far.
Yeah, we could imagine that the rendering of that could change, and then it could be interactive at some point. But on the sort of the first rev of this is we're trying to make sure that we got a architecture that allowed us to plug in providers and then to connect them up to build sort of the core of what we needed to build, and also make it extensible. And so far, you know, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have an addition about workflows. So in the system that you mentioned, 8 to 10, the creator, he implemented a BPMN engine execution. Yeah, so you can draw a diagram on bpmn.io and then upload it in that engine and attach logic to each block that can be called then in JavaScript or .NET. So maybe it can be useful for Orchard Core and for someone in this chat.
I will say that a few of the modules, we also have plugged in a JavaScript provider there, and that for a lot of our sort of conditional workflows and even places where we want to attach custom values and do other things, that's looking very useful, because it kind of opens up a lot of territory for us. And then I think that JavaScript module can also call into some of the Orchard has a concept of a sort of a JavaScript extension where JavaScript could call in and talk to other things like Content Manager. So we are using JavaScript for both some conditional branching, as well as doing some other things that we could do with Content Manager. Yeah, so we're using it. We have a one of these pipeline providers that is where we can add a JavaScript module. And then at that point, typically it's doing some pretty simple stuff for us. So it might be doing, we're kind of trying to keep that very light, because the debugging of that can get tricky. But in a lot of cases for conditional branching, it's proving very helpful, and we can essentially branch to any of those pipeline providers that we have. And the other thing that we can do is pipelines can call other pipelines as well. So we have the ability to sort of create a fair number of pipelines. In some cases, we're creating, some of our tenants have a lot of pipelines. And then those pipelines can call each other. And then the JavaScript can get in there with some, on the fly evaluation, and then make some decisions on pipelines and routing and data collection as well. Oh, and then a couple, yeah, just one other thing, and then Eric's not really covering it, but we have the core of pipeline building, and this is heavily using Orchard. Those pipelines are being stored as content objects, and then we're also including a recipe so that when we stand up a default tenant, we can provision automatically, one or a couple of default pipelines there. So when we stand up a tenant, and we kind of push down or ingest a whole bunch of FAQ content, we also pull in a default pipeline. We make it a default pipeline. We pull in a whole bunch of default reports. And then this is sort of built out of the box in a very basic way with a welcome card, the key phrase extraction and lookup over in Azure with a cognitive service. rendering of FAQs, and then optionally connecting with an agent. So not only do we kind of build out the facility to build the pipeline, but we're also using those documents to automatically stage out some default, let's say, pipelines. Eric, do you want to talk anything about sort of some of the small things we've done around content, moving content around between tenants that we have done, maybe even on the export or import side of that as well, sort of outside of pipelines?
Yeah, in some cases we've had to build some additional import-export steps. If I can just sort of do a quick one here.
Because we were running into content collisions.
Yeah, there are some cases where the sort of the out of the box content export steps would have some issues where metadata wouldn't be stripped out as we'd expected if you wanted to re-import it as a new item. Right, I gotta filter these. So in some cases we've built out, custom export steps that can be used to export our content types. The other thing that's a common problem is where we've got, links between content items where we've got like our route to agent pipeline step will be referencing, an agent list document. So we have to export both of those pieces in order for it to come in correctly on a new tenant. Or, anything that uses the taxonomy types was somewhat difficult to do correctly if we wanted to get that to move from one tenant or, from one environment to another.
Because a lot of times we'll want to categorize, let's say, FAQs, or we want to categorize reports. So we would have, let's say, we would be using a taxonomy service, but then when we move them across tenants, we need to sort of carry both payloads with us. So Eric did some things to sort of allow that to happen sort of magically.
Yeah, it's been very helpful that all of this is open source and we can kind of go in and find examples of things that we need to use. And, a lot of it, sometimes it doesn't work exactly the way we need it to, but we can usually take it and tweak it and make it work the way we want it to.
Yeah, and then I will say that, historically looking back, seeing a lot of available content, and then also seeing, YouTube videos where people are, at Lombec walking through code and then demonstrating things was incredibly helpful. And a lot of times I would watch something and I would sort of immediately say, well, that could be very useful. And then also look at features that were there, like the SEO feature that all of a sudden overrides and adds a lot of content to content definition and adds SEO features there was very useful. And immediately, you kind of start to imagine some other things we could do there. So I want to say thank you to everyone who created those. Very helpful.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. Mike has a question. I will allow his mic. You can talk now.
You're muted.
Sure. And I think we're into probably Q&A and then probably a few minutes and wrapping up.
Mike, if you're talking, you're muted.
Actually, we have 1 minute left from the Q&A session because you started it, and then we will have the breakout room.
Okay. So in our breakout room, there's a lot of territory to cover here. We're using Orchard extensively. We do have Patrick who's ready to go through how we built out a web client theming module with Orchard and how we're using that to sort of configure our web client experience. That could be very helpful. And then we're also available in the breakout session to answer any questions. Fikri could talk to dashboard utilization, SignalR, and things like that. And would be happy to see anyone in the breakout and go through really any questions that you have.
Yeah. Can you, Mike, write down your question? I allowed your microphone. I'm not sure why you can't unmute yourself.
Well, we're happy to take any questions, and it's been a learning curve, but we've been very happy with the results and sort of now the ability for us to add additional features and move information between tenants. And we're kind of getting our tenants stand up down to like sub 10 minutes, and I can imagine that moving forward we'll take that to almost automatic, where we can stand up a tenant sort of out of the box with a lot of content and everything ready to go very quickly. So yeah,
I think I can talk now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Hey, I was trapped all day.
Yay.
Hey, question about your reporting. So are all the data that's coming in from all your channels, is that going into a database created by YesSQL, or is that something that you guys are storing in a different fashion and accessing in a different fashion?
Yeah, I'll let Eric cover that, and we've made a few changes to that based on some load testing we've been doing. But Eric, you want to cover that?
Yeah. So basically, all of our content items, our chat sessions, are stored as YesSQL documents. So for some performance reasons, we've had to kind of split apart. I'll have to go probably to the I don't think I have anything in this new tenant because I stood it up just for today. But if I go into I can go and look at some of the content items for the chat sessions that Patrick did or Peyton did just a little while ago. So at this point, we've got one document that represents sort of metadata and all the basic information about a chat. And then there's sort of a chat transcript document that's a sub document that kind of hangs off of that. And our reporting engine will look at these chat document records, and there's sort of a whole thing with this, our report definitions, because we wanted to make them very flexible. So it's gotten to the point where it'd almost be easier to write SQL maybe. But the idea was that someone could, if they knew what they were doing, get in here and easily, modify these so that we're not having to make code changes every time somebody asks for a slight change to a report.
I mean, to be able to create those definitions to run your report, that data has to be stored in some sort of an index, right? So do you index every property that you store in the metadata so you can easily allow the report to query the data?
So that is something that we're going to have to look at down the line as we go. We've quite frankly just running YesSQL databases on Azure with a fairly reasonable, I think we're running usually like a Like a S3 database maybe, and we've been putting 5,000 or 6,000 chats through it every day and running reports. So,
I mean, how do you do it today? Do you store all your metadata into an index, a common index per tenant, and then basically use the definition to generate the query, then to query that index that return the data, and based on the output definition, you output the data? Is that what you're doing today?
we're really not that complicated yet. The typical, we have a couple of custom indexes for tracking, chat sessions by the session ID and, date times, and sometimes, the guest that uses it is another index that we've created, and sort of the agent that handled the chat is another index. But to be honest, we haven't seen a whole lot of performance issues once I sort of figured out how to do this correctly anyway.
Yeah, and the reporting module itself for us at some point, it might change around a little bit. The idea of conditionally storing metadata across, as added to a session, and then being able to report on that has been very important to us. And then the ability for us to create, right now we're creating all these definitions. We have imagined that people would create definitions, but we're creating them and sort of moving them around tenants. And then we're also looking at ways that we might be able to maybe synchronize reports from, say, a master repo somewhere, so that if we create a new reports, the tenant automatically gets them and things like that. But yeah, the ability for us to define those and then use them, and then have them stored as definitions has been helpful. And
can we look at that query conditions, please? I don't. My question isn't answered, but I think I'm having a hard time explaining it. So when you do the metric, the session that was connected with agent, right? When you write that, you convert that to SQL at some point, so you can pull the data. Now that was connected with agent, is that a column in an index? So you're running your query against indexes.
That is not actually. That is just, if I was to go to this document, it's interesting. So if I go back to a session document, it's really quite basic. Is we have a metadata part that we attach to a document, and this is really just a dictionary of key value pairs. So the thing that we'll index on will usually be session ID, and then the started and ended dates. So those do have a YesSQL index. And really, we haven't had the need yet to add indexes on any of this other stuff yet. It's once we sort of figured out how we can use the indexes that we have to query things efficiently, performance hasn't really been an issue yet.
Just a thought, you might be able to enable the content field indexes, use content fields, and then maybe use Open Graph to query the data. That way you're writing, Open Graph, which is a syntax that's kind of known to query the data. And then you'll utilize indexes that are provided by Orchard Core by default. I'm sure Sebastian will argue and have a better idea, but that's the thought.
No idea what you're talking about, but I'm sure I wrote the code.
We'll take all feedback. It's all good.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are many, many better ways to do this than what we've done so far, but
we're covering a lot of territory here. So some cases it's get something up and breathing in a fairly good way. And then, we are adjusting after we load test it, but yeah, there's a lot of territory to cover for sure.
I must say,
Cherry
what you guys
first.
have done is impressive so far.
It's been a team effort, and yeah, we're all kind of doing our thing. It's been fun because we're sort of in nice territory where we can build what we think are kind of cool things, and then have it come to life. And then yeah, it's been very exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot of good pieces to build on here. So, there's so many things that we haven't had to implement for ourselves. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but that's the way it is with everything. And we're not having to spend all this time working up, building out our own permissions and navigation and content fields and
Multi-tenancy and
there's we can move very quickly. Like, as I think I mentioned, 18 months ago, we hadn't done anything. This is all sort of started since January 2022.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we should have started the breakout room session 5 minutes ago. So I have to stop this now, but you can continue in the conversation in the breakout rooms. And thank you very much for your presentation. I'm happy to see that a lot of participants were really interested in your topic.